I'll never forget the moment I picked up that crumpled $10 bill from my grandmother's coffee table. Such a small thing, really. Just a piece of paper that somehow became the label that followed me for 15 years. Emma's so greedy, they'd whisper at family gatherings. Remember when she took that $10? Poor Bob needed it for gas money. What they didn't know was that $10 belonged to me in the first place, money I'd earned helping Grandma Rose with her weekend yard sales. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the truth never mattered to them. They needed someone to blame for their own shortcomings, and I was always the easiest target. That $10 bill sat in my wallet for years, not because I was greedy, but because it reminded me of something important. It was proof that they would twist any story, no matter how small, to make me the villain. Every time I looked at it, I remembered the lesson my grandmother taught me that day, though I didn't understand it then. She pulled me aside after the whole scene, her weathered hands gentle on my shoulders, and said, "Emma, honey, people will always judge what they can see. But real wealth? That's something they'll never understand until it's too late." The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, cutting through the quiet of my Chicago apartment like a knife through silence. Uncle Bob's voice was strained, older than I remembered, carrying the weight of something heavy. "Emma, it's your Aunt Pat. She had a stroke yesterday. We're at Springfield General, and," he paused, the silence stretching between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. "And she's been asking for you." I stared out my apartment window at the city skyline, watching the morning commuters hurry along the sidewalks below. It had been 3 years since I'd been back to Springfield, 3 years since the last family gathering where Michael had made another joke about my greedy childhood, and Sarah had laughed like it was the funniest thing she'd ever heard. 3 years since I'd decided that blood relations didn't automatically deserve my time, energy, or forgiveness. But Uncle Bob sounded different this time. Broken maybe, or just tired of carrying everyone else's weight. "She keeps saying she needs to tell you something important," he continued. "About Rose's things. About stuff we found in the house after the funeral." My grandmother Rose had passed 6 months ago, and I'd driven down for the funeral alone. No partner, no emotional support, just me in my black dress sitting in the third pew, while the family that had spent decades calling me selfish suddenly praised my devotion to the woman who'd raised me after my parents died. The irony wasn't lost on me, but grief has a way of making everything else feel small and petty. After the service, there had been the usual awkwardness. Pat hovering around Rose's jewelry box, Michael eyeing the antique furniture, Sarah taking pictures of anything that looked valuable with her phone. They divided up Rose's belongings like vultures, leaving me with photo albums and her collection of romance novels. "Emma doesn't need much," Pat had said, with that patronizing smile I knew so well. "She's got her big city job and all." They had no idea that those photo albums contained handwritten notes from Rose, little messages about investments and properties I'd never heard of. They had no idea that the romance novels had business cards tucked between the pages, cards from lawyers and financial advisors whose names meant nothing to me then. All they saw was a woman who'd lived modestly in a small house on Maple Street, clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores. Now Pat was in the hospital, and something about Rose's things needed discussing. The whole situation felt like another trap, another opportunity for them to need something from me while simultaneously resenting my existence. But Uncle Bob rarely asked for anything, and despite everything, he'd been the one person in that family who'd never called me greedy. He just stayed quiet, which sometimes felt worse than the accusations. "I'll drive down this afternoon," I heard myself saying, surprising us both. "But Bob, I need you to understand something. I'm not coming back to be everyone's emotional punching bag. If this is another situation where I'm expected to fix everything while being grateful for scraps, I'm turning around and leaving." There was silence on the other end, then a sound that might have been relief. "Emma, I know we haven't been fair to you. Any of us, but this thing with Rose's estate, it's bigger than we thought. Way bigger, and Pat knows something she never told the rest of us." The drive from Chicago to Springfield took 4 hours. 4 hours of memories I'd spent years trying to organize into neat mental boxes. There was the box labeled childhood trauma, filled with instances of being blamed for things that weren't my fault. The box labeled family obligations, overflowing with holidays, where I brought expensive gifts and got handmade cards in return, with birthdays where I paid for dinner and listened to complaints about money. And then there was the smallest box, the one I rarely opened, labeled "What if they actually loved me?" That last box was the most dangerous one, because it contained all the moments that made me question my own memories. Uncle Bob teaching me to change oil in his garage. Aunt Pat braiding my hair for school pictures. Michael letting me tag along to the arcade when we were kids. Were those real moments of affection, or just the basic decency adults show children? Had I imagined the shift that happened when I started doing well in school, when I got into college, when I landed my first real job? The truth was complicated, like most family truths. They had loved me in their way. But they'd also resented me, especially after I started succeeding in ways they couldn't. Every promotion I earned became evidence of my selfishness. Every dollar I saved became proof of my greed. They needed me to stay small so they could feel big, and when I refused to shrink, I became the enemy. Springfield looked exactly the same as I pulled into town, like a place that had decided decades ago to stop trying to grow. The same fast food restaurants, the same small businesses, with hand-painted signs, the same feeling that everyone knew everyone else's business. I drove past Betty's Kitchen, where the family used to go for Sunday brunch, past the community center where we'd had countless birthday parties and holiday gatherings, past the auto repair shop, where Uncle Bob had worked for 30 years without a single vacation, the hospital parking lot.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Lot was nearly empty, which made sense for a Tuesday afternoon, in a town where nothing much happened. I sat in my car for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, and trying to prepare myself for whatever conversation was waiting inside. Part of me wondered if this was all an elaborate setup, if Pat was fine, and this was just another way to get me back into their orbit. But Uncle Bob's voice on the phone had been too raw, too genuine for performance. Inside, the hospital smelled like disinfectant and sadness, with that particular fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look sick whether they are or not. Uncle Bob was pacing in the waiting area, his work clothes wrinkled like he'd slept in them. When he saw me, his face crumpled with relief, and something that looked like shame. "Emma, thank God you came." He pulled me into a hug that felt desperate, like he was drowning, and I was the life preserver. "She's been in and out of consciousness, but when she's awake, she keeps asking for you. She says she needs to tell you about Rose's safety deposit box." My blood went cold. What safety deposit box? Uncle Bob looked around the waiting room, then lowered his voice. "The one we found the key to yesterday, hidden in Rose's bedroom. Pat knew about it all along, but she never said anything. She thought it was just papers, birth certificates and stuff. But the bank manager called this morning, and Emma, they need you to come in. Something about your name being on the account." None of this made sense. Rose had lived simply, saving every penny, shopping at discount stores, and refusing to buy anything new when something old could be repaired. The idea that she had a safety deposit box, much less one with my name on it, seemed impossible. But then I remembered all those business cards hidden in her books, all those cryptic notes about investments, that I'd assumed were just her way of dreaming about a better life. "Where's Michael and Sarah?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Uncle Bob's jaw tightened. "They left this morning, said they couldn't afford to miss any more work. But they'll be back tomorrow when we meet with the bank." He paused, studying my face. "Emma, there's something else. Pat told me some things yesterday, before the stroke. About how we've treated you. About that $10 everybody always brings up." My chest tightened. "Bob, I don't need to rehash ancient history." "Yes you do," he said firmly. "Because it wasn't ancient to you, was it? You've been carrying that around for 15 years, and we've been throwing it in your face every chance we got." He sat down heavily in one of the plastic waiting room chairs, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Pat told me what really happened that day. How you'd been helping Rose with yard sales for months, how that $10 was yours to begin with. How Rose had asked you to take it because she was proud of how hard you'd worked." The memory hit me like a physical blow. I was 12 years old, counting change at Rose's card table while she sold her neighbors' cast-offs and donated items. I'd spent the entire morning helping her organize, price, and sell, learning about negotiation and customer service without realizing it was education. At the end of the day, Rose had handed me that $10 bill with a smile. "This is yours, sweetheart. You earned every penny." But when we got back to the house, Pat had seen the money and started asking questions. Where did it come from? Why did Emma get it? What about Michael? Didn't he deserve something too? Before I knew what was happening, I was being lectured about sharing and family, and not being greedy. The money had been sitting on Rose's coffee table, and when Pat stepped away to answer the phone, I'd picked it up. It was mine after all. That's when Michael walked in and saw me holding the bill. Emma's stealing money, he'd announced, and suddenly I was surrounded by adults demanding explanations. My attempts to explain fell on deaf ears. Rose wasn't there to defend me, she'd gone to lie down with one of her headaches. And somehow, in the space of 10 minutes, I'd become the greedy child who'd taken money that didn't belong to her. She told me everything, Uncle Bob continued, his voice heavy with regret. How she watched us brand you as selfish over something that was rightfully yours. How she tried to defend you but we wouldn't listen. How that became the excuse we used every time you succeeded at something we couldn't. I felt tears threatening, and blinked them back. Why are you telling me this now? Because Pat realized something yesterday, going through Rose's papers. Your grandmother left instructions, Emma, specific instructions about her estate, about things she wanted you to know. And Pat's been sitting on them for 6 months, too proud or too scared to follow through. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, yellowed and sealed. She asked me to give you this before you see her. The envelope was addressed to me in Rose's careful handwriting, with a note on the outside, to be opened only by Emma Rodriguez, and only after my passing. My hands shook as I broke the seal, and unfolded the letter inside. My dearest Emma, it began, if you're reading this then I'm gone, and Pat has finally done what I asked her to do. I hope she's found the courage to tell you the truth about many things, but knowing Pat, she probably hasn't. So let me tell you myself. The letter went on for 3 pages, written in Rose's neat script. She detailed years of investments I'd never known about, properties purchased quietly throughout Ohio and Indiana, stock portfolios managed through advisors I'd never met. She'd been far from the simple woman everyone believed her to be. She'd been building something carefully and deliberately, for decades. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph. Everything I built for you. You were the only one who ever helped without expecting anything in return. The only one who listened to my stories and asked thoughtful questions. The only one who saw me as more than just an old woman with outdated ideas. The lawyers will explain the details, but Emma, you need to know that you're not just inheriting my things. You're inheriting the responsibility I've been preparing you for your entire life. At the bottom of the letter was a number written in red ink, $127 million. I read it 3 times before the zeros made sense. $127 million. The woman who'd clipped coupons and darned socks had been worth more than some small country's GDP. And she'd left it all to the granddaughter, everyone called greedy, for taking $10. Uncle Bob was watching my face, and whatever he saw there made him lean forward. Emma, what does it say? I folded the letter carefully, and slipped it back into the envelope. It says I need to see Pat, right now. The walk to Pat's room felt like a journey through time, past all the hurt and resentment, and years of feeling like I wasn't enough. The woman lying in the hospital bed looked smaller than I remembered, fragile in a way that made my anger feel complicated. Her eyes opened when I entered, and I saw recognition there, followed immediately by something that looked like fear. Emma, she whispered, her voice slurred from the stroke. You came. I came, I confirmed, sitting in the chair beside her bed. Bob gave me Rose's letter. Pat's eyes closed, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. I was supposed to give it to you 6 months ago. The day after the funeral. But I hoped that maybe, if I waited, if I looked through her things first, I could find some way to make it fair. Some way to make sure Michael and Sarah got something too. And what did you find, Pat? I found out that your grandmother was smarter than all of us combined, she said, her words slow but clear. I found out that she'd been watching us, watching how we treated you, and making decisions based on what she saw. Pat struggled to sit up, and I helped adjust her pillows. Emma, she left instructions about everything, about why she chose you, about what she wanted us to know. Tell me. Pat took a shaky breath. She said that every time we called you greedy, she put more money into your accounts. Every time we made you feel small, she bought another property in your name. Every time we took your kindness for granted, she made another investment for your future. Pat's voice broke. She said she was teaching us a lesson about the difference between taking what you deserve and being given what you've earned. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. They'd spent 15 years calling me greedy over $10, not knowing that their grandmother was building me an empire worth more than they could imagine. Every snide comment, every eye roll, every family gathering, where I was made to feel like the problem had actually been making me richer. There's more, Pat continued. The lawyers want to meet with you tomorrow. There are properties that need managing, investments that need oversight. And Pat paused, looking at me with something that might have been respect. There's a foundation she wants you to start. For kids who age out of the foster system, kids like you were, before we took you in. That detail hit me harder than the money. Rose had seen not just how her family treated me, but why it mattered. She'd understood that I knew what it felt like to be unwanted, to be taken in out of obligation rather than love. And she'd built something that would let me help other kids who were living that same reality. Pat, I said gently, why didn't you give me the letter when you were supposed to? She was quiet for so long, I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then barely audible, because I was jealous, because I knew that once you found out what Rose really thought of you, you'd never need us again. And despite everything, despite how terribly we've treated you, you're the best thing that ever happened to our family. Her eyes met mine, clear now despite the medication. You're the only one of us who turned out right. I sat with that for a moment, feeling 15 years of hurt and resentment begin to shift into something else. Not forgiveness, not yet, but understanding. They'd been threatened by my success, because it highlighted their failures. They'd called me greedy, because generosity was foreign to them. They'd made me feel small because they'd never learned how to make themselves feel big. Pat, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. She nodded weakly. That day with the $10, did you know it was mine? Another tear slipped down her cheek.
Yes.
Rose told me you'd earned it. But Michael was so upset about not getting anything, and it seemed easier to make you the bad guy than to explain why life isn't always fair. She paused. I've been making you the bad guy ever since. And I'm sorry, Emma. I'm so sorry. For the first time in 15 years, the apology felt real. Not strategic. Not manipulative. Just the exhausted confession of a woman who'd finally run out of excuses. I reached over and took her hand, surprised by how small it felt in mine. I forgive you, Pat. But things are going to be different now. She squeezed my hand with what little strength she had. I know, and they should be. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, then walked back to the waiting room, where Uncle Bob was still pacing. When he saw my face, he stopped moving. The meeting with the lawyers is tomorrow at noon. I said, and Bob, you might want to call Michael and Sarah. Tell them they should probably sit down before you explain what's about to happen. That night, I sat in my old room at Bob's house, surrounded by the same furniture and decorations from my teenage years, and tried to process the magnitude of what had changed. In the space of one day, I'd gone from being the family disappointment to being wealthier than everyone I'd ever known combined. But more than that, I'd gone from being the person they reluctantly tolerated to being the person Rose had chosen to carry on her legacy. The $10 bill was still in my wallet, creased and faded after all these years. I pulled it out and smoothed it on the bedside table, remembering the 12-year-old girl who'd been so hurt by their accusations. She couldn't have imagined that the thing they'd punished her for would become the foundation of the biggest reversal of fortune in family history. Tomorrow I would meet with lawyers and accountants. Tomorrow I would learn about properties and investments and foundations. Tomorrow Michael and Sarah would have to reconcile their image of greedy Emma with the reality of Emma the millionaire. But tonight I just sat with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the people who deserve justice actually get it. And sometimes it comes with interest. The next morning brought clarity in ways I hadn't expected. As I sat in Bob's kitchen drinking coffee from the same chipped mug I'd used as a teenager, memories started connecting like dots on a map I'd never noticed before. Each incident, each comment, each moment of being made to feel lesser, suddenly formed a pattern that was both devastating and illuminating. It started with the college fund incident. When I was 17, I'd worked 2 jobs that summer, saving every penny for my freshman year expenses, while Michael spent his days at the community pool and his evenings playing video games. When August came, and it was time to buy textbooks, I'd proudly shown Pat my savings account statement. $3,000, earned through endless shifts at the grocery store and weekend babysitting gigs. "That's wonderful, honey," Pat had said, but there was something in her voice that felt wrong. "You know, Michael's been feeling really bad about not having spending money for his senior year. Maybe you could share some of that. Just a loan, of course." I was 17 and desperate to belong, so I'd handed over $800 that I never saw again. When I'd asked about it the following Christmas, Pat had looked at me like I was being petty. "Family helps family. Emma, I can't believe you're keeping track of money between cousins." But I was keeping track, because I had to. Nobody else was looking out for my future, so I'd learned to look out for it myself. That $800 meant 2 fewer textbooks, which meant more hours in the library, waiting for books to become available, which meant less time for studying, which meant lower grades that first semester. The ripple effect of their thoughtlessness had nearly derailed my entire freshman year. Then there was the graduation gift situation. When I'd finished college with honors, the family had pooled together to buy me a card and a $25 gift certificate to Target. I'd been grateful, genuinely grateful, because at least they'd remembered. But 6 months later, when Michael had graduated from community college with a barely passing GPA, they'd thrown him a party that cost more than my monthly rent and bought him a used car. The disparity hadn't been lost on me, but when I'd mentioned it to Bob, he'd shrugged uncomfortably. "Michael needed the car for work, Emma. You've got a good job already." I did have a good job already. I worked my ass off to get that good job, starting with internships I'd applied for myself, interviews I'd prepared for alone, and networking events I'd attended while my cousins were out partying. Every success I'd achieved had been met with the same response. "Well, Emma's always been good at taking care of herself." They'd turned my competence into a weapon against me. My ability to survive and thrive, despite their neglect, had become justification for more neglect. And every time I tried to point out the unfairness, I'd been labeled as greedy, selfish, or ungrateful. The phone rang, interrupting my spiral down memory lane. Bob answered it in the living room, and I could hear the tension in his voice immediately. "No, Michael, she's not here to cause trouble. She's here because Pat asked for her." A pause. "What do you mean, what's she after?" "She's not after anything. She drove 4 hours, because family called." Another pause, longer this time. "No, I don't think that's fair. And frankly, I'm getting tired of pretending it is." I walked to the doorway and caught Bob's eye. He looked embarrassed, but determined, like a man who'd finally decided to stop enabling bad behavior. When he hung up, he shook his head. "Michael and Sarah are driving down this morning. They want to be here for the meeting with the lawyers." He paused, studying my face. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no." "What is it?" "They think this meeting is about dividing up Rose's assets equally among the family. They think you being named on the safety deposit box is just a technicality, something to do with you helping Rose with paperwork over the years." Bob sat down heavily. I didn't correct them. Maybe I should have. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I kept holding it, because it gave my hands something to do. "Why didn't you tell them what Pat said yesterday?" "Because I wanted them to hear it from the lawyers. I wanted them to understand this wasn't some conspiracy between you and Rose, or some trick you'd pulled. I wanted them to see that their grandmother made these decisions, based on years of watching how we all behaved. It was a kind gesture, but I wondered if Bob understood what he was setting up." Michael and Sarah were going to walk into that lawyer's office, expecting one thing and discover something completely different. The shock alone would be devastating, but then would come the anger, the accusations, the desperate attempts to find some way to overturn or contest what Rose had done. "Bob, they're going to blame me. You know that, right? They're going to assume I manipulated Rose somehow, that I convinced her to cut them out." "Or let them blame you," Bob said with more steel in his voice than I'd heard in years. "Let them blame you for being the granddaughter who called every week, who visited every month, who never asked for anything, but gave everything she had. Let them blame you for being the one Rose trusted with her legacy. His words surprised me, but they also revealed something I hadn't fully grasped yet. Rose hadn't just left me money, she'd left me the responsibility of deciding what happened next. The foundation she wanted me to start, the properties that needed managing, the investments that required oversight, all of it was now my choice to make. And more importantly, my family's financial future was now dependent on my goodwill. The irony was so complete, it felt like divine justice. They had spent 15 years making me feel like I owed them something, like my success was somehow a debt I needed to repay through endless generosity and tolerance of their mistreatment. Now if they wanted any piece of Rose's estate, they would literally owe me. There's something else you should know. Bob continued. Pat told me yesterday that Rose left specific instructions about the family, about who gets what, and under what conditions. My stomach tightened. What kind of conditions? The kind that require apologies. Real ones. And changes in behavior that Rose wanted to see before anyone received a penny. Bob reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out another envelope. This one addressed to him. She left letters for each of us. Instructions about what we needed to do to make things right with you. The complexity of Rose's plan was becoming clear. She hadn't just left me wealthy. She'd structured her estate to force my family to confront their behavior. They could continue treating me poorly and get nothing, or they could genuinely change and receive forgiveness along with financial support. It was brilliant and cruel, and exactly the kind of long-term thinking I should have expected from a woman who'd secretly built a fortune, while everyone assumed she was barely getting by. Have you read your letter? I asked. Bob nodded, looking ashamed. She wasn't gentle about pointing out my mistakes. She told me exactly how many times I'd stood by and watched Michael or Pat treat you unfairly. How many times I'd chosen the easy path of staying quiet instead of defending you. He paused. She said that silence in the face of injustice is just another form of cruelty. That sounded like Rose. She'd never been one to sugarcoat uncomfortable truths, and apparently Dad hadn't changed that tendency. I found myself wondering what she'd written to Michael and Sarah, what specific incidents she'd cataloged, what changes she was demanding. When do they need to read their letters? Before the meeting with the lawyers. Rose wanted everyone to understand exactly why she made the choices she did before they learned what those choices were. 3 hours later, I was sitting in the conference room at Harrison and Associates, watching my family read letters that were clearly devastating them. Michael's face had gone through several color changes, from confusion to anger, to something that looked like genuine remorse. Sarah kept wiping her eyes, occasionally looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite. Bob was rereading his letter, nodding slowly like he was accepting a difficult truth. James Harrison, the estate attorney, sat patiently at the head of the table, surrounded by folders and documents that represented decades of Rose's careful planning. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of quiet competence that suggested he'd dealt with complicated family dynamics before. Miss Rodriguez, he said when everyone had finished reading, before we
Discuss the specifics of your grandmother's estate. I want you to know that she spoke about you often during our meetings. She was extraordinarily proud of the woman you'd become, and she was very specific about her reasons for structuring the inheritance as she did. Michael looked up sharply. What do you mean structuring it? Aren't we just here to divide everything equally? Harrison's expression didn't change, but I caught the slight pause that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. Mrs. Martinez made very specific decisions about her estate distribution. Those decisions were based on years of observation and careful consideration of each family member's character and behavior. Just tell us what she left us, Sarah said, her voice tight with tension. Harrison opened the first folder. The estate consists of several components. Real estate holdings valued at approximately $43 million, including residential and commercial properties across Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. Investment portfolios worth $62 million, managed through various financial institutions. Cash assets totaling $18 million, held in multiple accounts, and a business portfolio valued at approximately $4 million. The silence in the room was profound. I could hear the air conditioning humming, the distant sound of traffic outside, the faint scratching of Harrison's pen as he made notes. $127 million. Even knowing it was coming, hearing it laid out in specific terms made it feel surreal. The primary beneficiary of this estate,
Harrison continued, is Emma Rodriguez, who receives full ownership and control of all assets, with specific instructions about establishing a charitable foundation and managing ongoing family considerations. Michael's face had gone white. Primary beneficiary. What about the rest of us? Mrs. Martinez left detailed provisions for other family members, contingent upon meeting specific requirements outlined in your individual letters. Harrison's tone remained professional, but I could see the compassion in his eyes. These provisions are substantial, but they are not automatic. What kind of requirements? Pat asked from her wheelchair. She'd insisted on being discharged from the hospital for this meeting, against her doctor's advice. Harrison looked at me before answering. Mrs. Martinez wanted genuine acknowledgement of past wrongs, sincere apologies, and demonstrated changes in behavior toward Miss Rodriguez. She believed that money given without accountability would only perpetuate harmful patterns. The room erupted. Michael started talking about legal challenges and undue influence. Sarah demanded to know what specific behavior changes were required. Pat sat quietly, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't seem surprised by any of this. There's more, Harrison said, when the chaos died down. Mrs. Martinez also left instructions about what should happen if these requirements are not met. In that case, the entire estate goes directly to the charitable foundation, with no provisions for family members. That stopped the arguing immediately. Rose had given them a choice: treat me with genuine respect and receive generous financial support, or continue the old patterns and get nothing. It was accountability on a scale that none of them could ignore. I need some air, Michael said abruptly, pushing back from the table. We all need some air, Sarah agreed, following him out. Bob and Pat remained seated, both looking like they were processing something profound. Harrison began organizing his papers, giving us space to absorb what we'd just learned. Emma, Pat said quietly, what do you want from us? It was the first time in my life that anyone in my family had asked me that question. Not what I could do for them, not what I owed them, but what I actually wanted. The simplicity of it was almost overwhelming. I want what Rose wanted, I said finally. I want to be treated like family instead of like a resource. I want my contributions to be acknowledged instead of dismissed. I want genuine relationships instead of transactional ones. Pat nodded slowly. And if we can't give you that, then you'll have answered Rose's question about whether you're capable of change. Part 3. The protective response. The afternoon after the lawyers' meeting, I found myself sitting in Rose's old house on Maple Street, surrounded by the possessions my family had divided up 6 months earlier. Bob had given me the key, explaining that technically the house was mine now, along with everything in it. The thought of my relatives pawing through Rose's belongings, while she was barely cold in the ground, made my stomach turn, but I was here for a different reason. I needed to understand who my grandmother really was. The woman I'd known had been loving but modest, generous but careful with money, wise but never flashy about her intelligence. The woman described in those legal documents was a financial mastermind who'd built an empire, while letting everyone believe she was living paycheck to paycheck. I wanted to know how those two versions of Rose fit together. Her bedroom had been stripped of most personal items, but I knew where to look. Rose had always kept her most important things in places others wouldn't think to search. I found the first box hidden behind winter coats in the back of her closet, filled with financial statements dating back 20 years. The progression was remarkable: modest investments in the beginning, growing larger and more sophisticated as her confidence and knowledge increased. But it was the handwritten journal buried at the bottom of the box that truly revealed her strategy. Page after page of observations about our family dynamics, careful notes about who contributed what to holiday gatherings, detailed records of who called, who visited, who offered help, versus who only asked for it. She'd been conducting a decades-long study of our character, and the results were damning for everyone except me. Michael requested $500 for car repairs, read one entry from 3 years ago. Same week he posted photos of expensive dinner at steakhouse. Asked Emma to cover the difference when check bounced. Sarah complained about Emma bringing store-bought dessert to Christmas instead of homemade. Read another. Conveniently forgot that Emma worked double shifts all week to afford presents for everyone else's children. Pat criticized Emma for not calling enough, said a third entry. Emma called twice that week. Pat hasn't initiated a call to Emma in 14 months. Page after page of meticulous documentation, building a case that would be ironclad in any court of family opinion. Rose had seen everything, remembered everything, and quietly transferred wealth from her accounts to mine, with each incident of their callousness. The second box contained correspondence with financial advisors, letters that revealed the true scope of her intelligence. Rose hadn't just gotten lucky with investments, she'd studied market trends, researched companies, and made calculated decisions that consistently paid off. The woman who'd coupon clipped at the grocery store had been buying stock in those same companies, building wealth while everyone assumed she was barely scraping by. But the third box was what broke my heart. It contained letters she'd written but never sent, addressed to each member of our family. The one meant for me was dated just 3 months before her death. "My dearest Emma," it began. "I know you think I don't see how hard they are on you, but I see everything. I see how you light up when you think someone appreciates you, and I see how you dim when they take you for granted. I see how you give everything, and ask for nothing, and I see how they've learned to expect that as normal." The letter went on to explain her plan, her hope that inheriting responsibility along with wealth would force me to value myself the way she'd always valued me. She wrote about watching me grow up feeling like I had to earn love through usefulness, and her determination to give me the financial security to never feel that way again. "You think that $10 incident was about money," she wrote, "but it was never about money. It was about them teaching you that your worth was negotiable, that your truth was less important than their comfort. I want you to have enough money that you never have to negotiate your worth with anyone ever again." I was crying by the time I finished reading, not just from grief but from the overwhelming relief of being truly seen by someone who loved me. Rose had understood exactly what I'd been living through, and she'd spent years building me a way out. The sound of a car door slamming outside interrupted my emotional moment. Through the window, I saw Michael and Sarah walking up the front path, their expressions grim but determined. I quickly put the letters away and went to answer the door. "We need to talk," Michael said without preamble. "Come in," I replied, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever conversation they had planned. They followed me into Rose's living room, the same space where we'd had countless family gatherings over the years. Sarah perched on the edge of the sofa like she was ready to flee, while Michael paced near the window. "This whole thing is insane," he began. "Rose leaving everything to you, these ridiculous requirements, acting like we're terrible people who don't deserve anything. Aren't you?" I asked quietly. Michael stopped pacing. "What? Aren't you terrible people who don't deserve anything? At least aren't you terrible to me?" Sarah flinched like I'd slapped her. "Emma, we're family. We've had our problems, sure, but family doesn't just cut each other off over money." "You're right," I agreed. "Family doesn't cut each other off over money. But they also don't spend 15 years making one person feel worthless, and then expect her to be grateful for scraps." "We never made you feel worthless," Michael protested. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Michael, you literally just told a room full of people that I probably manipulated a dying old woman out of her money. Yesterday you called me greedy for existing. Last Christmas, you made jokes about my sad single life while I was paying for everyone's dinner. When exactly did you not make me feel worthless?" The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of years of unexamined behavior. Sarah was the first to speak. "We didn't mean it that way," she said softly. "How did you mean it then?" "Because from where I sit, it looks like you meant it exactly that way. You needed someone to be less than you, so you could feel bigger, and I was convenient." Michael sat down heavily. "Look, maybe we weren't always fair to you. But Rose was being ridiculous with all these conditions and requirements. We're supposed to what? Grovel for forgiveness just to get what should be ours anyway. What should be yours?" I stood up, feeling my grandmother's strength flowing through me. "What exactly should be yours, Michael?" "The money Rose saved while you were spending every penny you earned. The investments she made while you were borrowing money for vacations. The properties she bought while you were living paycheck to paycheck despite making good money. She was our grandmother too." Sarah said, "Yes, she was. And she watched how you treated her granddaughter for 15 years. She watched you take my kindness for granted, dismiss my achievements, and make fun of my struggles. She watched you use me as a bank, and then criticize me for being careful with money. I picked up one of the photo albums from Rose's coffee table, the same table where that infamous $10 bill had sat. She documented all of it, you know. Every incident, every slight, every time you chose cruelty over kindness. Michael's face had gone red. So what? She was spying on us, keeping some kind of score. She was paying attention, something you might have tried if you'd actually cared about anyone besides yourselves. That hit home. I could see it in the way Sarah's shoulders sagged, in the way Michael's anger deflated into something that looked more like shame. What do you want from us, Emma? Sarah asked, echoing Pat's question from earlier. I want you to read your letters. Really read them, not just skim them looking for the parts that hurt your feelings. I want you to think about whether Rose was wrong about anything she documented. And I want you to decide if you're capable of being the kind of people who deserve to be in my life. And if we're not, Michael asked, then you'll have plenty of time to figure it out, while you're not receiving any financial support from Rose's estate. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. For the first time in my life, they needed me more than I needed them. For the first time, my comfort and happiness mattered more than theirs. For the first time, I held all the cards. This isn't fair, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. You're absolutely right, I agreed. It's not fair that I had to grow up feeling like I wasn't enough. It's not fair that I spent 15 years being everyone's solution to problems I didn't create. It's not fair that I had to earn love through usefulness, while you got it for free just by existing. None of this is fair, Michael. But maybe for once, the unfairness is working in my favor. Sarah was crying now, but they weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen her use before. These looked genuine, like she was finally understanding the scope of what they'd done. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm really truly sorry. I know you are, I said gently. But sorry isn't enough anymore. Sorry is just the beginning of the work you need to do. After they left, I sat in Rose's living room as the sun set outside her windows, feeling something I'd never experienced before: complete control over my own life. I wasn't dependent on their approval, their affection, or their acceptance. I didn't need them to love me, though I hoped they would learn how. I didn't need them to change, though I hoped they were capable of it. For the first time in my life, I had the luxury of hoping for the best while being perfectly fine with the worst. And that, I realized, was the greatest gift Rose could have given me. Not just the money, though that was life-changing, but the freedom to love my family without needing them to love me back properly. The freedom to protect myself, while still keeping my heart open. Part 4. The desperate return. 2 weeks after the lawyers' meeting, my phone started ringing at all hours. The calls began tentatively, with polite requests for conversations and explanations. But as the reality of their financial situation began to sink in, the desperation grew more obvious. Michael called first, 3 days after our confrontation at Rose's house. His voice was strained, different from the cocky tone he'd used at the lawyer's office. Emma, I've been thinking about what you said, about the letters, about Rose's documentation. He paused, and I could hear voices in the background. Sarah and I are having some problems. Financial problems. The restaurant where she was working closed down last week, and my hours got cut at the plant. I waited, letting him fill the silence. The thing is, we were kind of counting on Rose's inheritance to help us out. We've got credit card debt, and the mortgage is behind, and without Sarah's income. His voice trailed off. What are you asking me, Michael? I'm asking if there's any way you could see fit to help us out while we work on meeting Rose's requirements. Just a temporary loan, maybe. Something to keep us afloat while we figure out how to make things right with you. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of calling me greedy, he was asking me for money. After years of dismissing my financial struggles, he wanted me to solve his. But what struck me most was that even in his desperation, he still couldn't bring himself to offer a genuine apology without conditions attached. Have you read your letter again? I asked. Yes, but Emma, some of those things Rose wrote, they're not exactly fair. I mean, she made it sound like I was deliberately trying to hurt you, but I wasn't. I was just living my life. Living your life at my expense. That's not how I saw it. That's exactly the problem, Michael. You never saw it. You never had to see it, because I was always there to fix whatever you broke.
Another pause. So you won't help us? I didn't say that. I said you need to actually do the work, Rose outlined instead of looking for shortcuts around it. He hung up without saying goodbye, which told me everything I needed to know about his level of commitment to change. Sarah called the next day, her approach more emotional but equally manipulative. Emma, I know we hurt you, and I'm sorry for that. I really am. But I need you to understand that Michael and I are in a really bad place right now. She was crying, or at least doing a good impression of it. We might lose the house, and I know that probably doesn't matter to you anymore, but I'm scared. Why would you think it doesn't matter to me? Because you hate us now. Because we were awful to you and now you have all this money and power, and you probably want us to suffer. That assumption revealed so much about how she saw the world. In Sarah's mind, relationships were zero-sum games, where someone had to lose for someone else to win. The idea that I might want genuine reconciliation, rather than revenge, was apparently incomprehensible to her. Sarah, I don't want you to suffer. I want you to grow. There's a difference. What if we can't? What if we're just not capable of being the kind of people Rose wanted us to be? It was an honest question, maybe the first one she'd ever asked me. Then you'll have learned something important about yourselves, and you'll have to live with the consequences of that knowledge. That's so cold. No, it's just honest. Cold would be if I actively tried to hurt you. Honest is letting you face the natural consequences of your choices. The calls from Bob were different. He didn't ask for money or make excuses. Instead, he called to update me on Pat's recovery and to share small observations about things he was noticing for the first time. I was thinking about that Christmas when you gave everyone such nice gifts, he said during one conversation. You must have spent a fortune on us, and we gave you that gift card to Target. I never really thought about how that must have felt. How does it make you feel now? I asked, ashamed and grateful that you kept showing up despite how little we appreciated you. Those conversations were easier, because Bob wasn't asking for anything except understanding. He was doing the hard work of examining his own behavior, without expecting immediate forgiveness or reward. But it was Pat's call that really broke my heart. She called from her physical therapy session, her speech still slurred, but her determination clear. Emma, I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago. She took a shaky breath. When your parents died, and you came to live with us, I was jealous of you. Jealous of me. I was 8 years old and had just lost everything. You were smart and resilient and kind, even after everything you'd been through. You made me feel inadequate as a parent, because you were turning out so well despite losing your real family. I think part of me wanted to keep you small so I could feel bigger. The honesty was devastating and liberating at the same time. Finally, someone was telling me the truth about what had been happening all those years. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I'm tired of carrying it around, and because you deserve to know that none of it was your fault. You were a wonderful child, who deserved better than what we gave you. Thank you for saying that. There's more. Rose knew how I felt about you. She called me out on it several times. Over the years, told me I was damaging a beautiful spirit with my own insecurities. I didn't listen then, but I'm listening now. That night, I sat in my Chicago apartment and tried to process the strange mixture of vindication and sadness I was feeling. The vindication came from finally having my experiences validated by the people who'd caused them. The sadness came from realizing how much time we'd all wasted. How many years of genuine relationship we'd lost to their pride and my defensive walls. My phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number, with a Springfield area code. Emma, this is James Harrison, the estate attorney. I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to give you a heads up about something. What's wrong? I received a call today from a law firm in Columbus. They're representing Michael and Sarah Martinez in what they're calling an inquiry into your grandmother's mental competency at the time she drafted her will. My blood went cold. They're trying to contest the will. It appears so. They're claiming that Mrs. Martinez was unduly influenced, and that the estate plan is so dramatically different from what a reasonable person would expect that it suggests diminished capacity. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of betrayal settling on my shoulders. Even faced with clear explanations of why Rose had made her choices, even given opportunities to earn forgiveness and financial support, they were choosing to fight rather than face the truth about themselves. What happens now? Well, the good news is that your grandmother anticipated this possibility. She was very thorough in documenting her mental acuity and her reasons for the estate structure. We have medical records, psychological evaluations, and hours of video testimony explaining her decision. Video testimony. She recorded detailed explanations of every major bequest and exclusion, along with specific examples of the behavior that influenced her choices. She was very determined that her wishes be honored regardless of any family challenges. Even in death, Rose was still protecting me. Still anticipating the ways my family might try to hurt me and building defenses against them. Mr. Harrison, I want you to fight this as hard as you can. Not because I need the money, but because Rose deserves to have her wishes respected. I understand completely. And Miss Rodriguez, for what it's worth, I've been practicing estate law for 15 years, and I've never seen someone put more thought and care into ensuring their legacy reflected their true values. Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman. After I hung up, I realized that Michael and Sarah had just made my decision easy. By choosing legal warfare over personal growth, they'd shown me exactly who they were when faced with real accountability. They were willing to destroy Rose's reputation and drag our family through public humiliation rather than acknowledge their own behavior. But they'd also done something else. They'd freed me from any lingering obligation to help them. Rose's conditions for their inheritance included treating me with respect and making genuine amends. Filing a lawsuit claiming she was mentally incompetent was pretty much the opposite of respecting her wishes. I picked up my phone and called Bob. I heard about the lawsuit, he said before I could speak. Are you part of it? Hell no. I think it's disgusting. His voice was hard with anger. Pat and I want nothing to do with it. We told Michael and Sarah they're on their own.
Good.
Because I'm about to make some decisions about the estate that they're really not going to like. What kind of decisions? The kind that Rose would have made if she'd known they were going to dishonor her memory. The next morning I called James Harrison and asked him to set up a meeting. It was time to activate the nuclear option that Rose had built into her estate plan, the one she'd hoped we'd never need to use. But Michael and Sarah had just made it necessary. Part 5. The Truth Confrontation. The meeting with the lawyers took place on a cold November morning in Springfield. I'd driven down from Chicago the night before, staying at a hotel instead of with Bob, because I wanted to keep some emotional distance from what was about to happen. This wasn't going to be a family conversation. It was going to be a legal and moral reckoning. James Harrison had asked me to arrive early so we could review Rose's video testimony before the others got there. The conference room at his office felt different this time, more formal and adversarial. Instead of family members reluctantly listening to an estate reading, we were preparing for battle. Before we start the recording, Harrison said, I want you to know that your grandmother made this video specifically for situations like this. She was very clear that if anyone tried to challenge her mental competency, this testimony should be shown to all parties involved. He pressed play on the laptop, and suddenly Rose was there, sitting in this same conference room but looking exactly like the sharp, intelligent woman I'd always known. The timestamp showed the recording was made just 2 months before her death. If you're watching this, Rose's voice filled the room. Then someone in my family has decided that I was too stupid or too crazy to make my own decisions about my money. Let me address that assumption directly. For the next hour, I watched my grandmother systematically dismantle every argument Michael and Sarah might make. She recited financial figures from memory, discussed complex investment strategies, and demonstrated a level of mental acuity that would impress anyone. But more importantly, she explained her reasoning for every major decision. Emma receives the bulk of my estate because Emma has been the only person in this family who has consistently shown character, integrity, and genuine love, without expectation of reward. Rose said, looking directly into the camera. For 15 years, I have watched this family take advantage of her generosity, dismiss her achievements, and make her feel small because her success highlighted their failures. The recording included specific examples. Rose had kept meticulous records of every family gathering, every financial request, every instance of dismissive behavior. She could cite exact quotes from conversations that had happened years earlier. Michael once told Emma that she was lucky to be smart, as if her academic achievements were some kind of cosmic accident rather than the result of hard work and dedication. Sarah regularly criticized Emma's appearance, her lifestyle choices, and her relationship status, then expected Emma to pay for family dinners without complaint. Pat and Bob enabled this behavior by staying silent when they should have spoken up. But the most devastating part of the testimony came when Rose addressed the $10 incident directly. I want to speak specifically about an incident that occurred when Emma was 12 years old, because it has become symbolic of how this family has treated her ever since. Rose's voice was steady but angry. Emma had worked for me all morning at a yard sale, helping elderly neighbors sort and price their belongings. She was patient with confused customers, careful with fragile items, and honest with change. At the end of the day, I gave her $10 because she had earned it. Rose's eyes flashed with something I'd rarely seen from her: pure anger. When we returned home, Patricia saw the money and immediately began questioning where it came from and why Emma deserved it. Instead of asking me directly, she created a situation where Emma was made to feel guilty for accepting payment for work she had done. When Emma tried to explain, she was ignored. When I tried to defend her, I was told I was spoiling her. The recording showed Rose leaning forward, her voice becoming more intense. That incident taught Emma that her worth was negotiable, that her truth could be dismissed, and that she would be blamed for things that weren't her fault. It also taught the rest of you that you could rewrite history to suit your needs, and face no consequences for doing so. Rose's voice carried decades of suppressed frustration. From that day forward, every time Emma succeeded at something, you found ways to diminish it. Every time she needed support, you found reasons why she didn't deserve it. And every time she gave generously to this family, you found ways to make her feel selfish for not giving more. The recording continued with Rose methodically documenting financial transactions, showing bank statements and receipts that proved Emma had contributed thousands of dollars to family expenses over the years, while receiving minimal support in return. She had records of graduation gifts, holiday presents, emergency loans that were never repaid, and countless instances where Emma had been
expected to cover expenses for events she hadn't even wanted to attend. I want to be absolutely clear about something, Rose said near the end of the recording. Emma did not manipulate me into leaving her my estate. Emma has never asked me for money, never hinted that she expected an inheritance, and never treated me differently because of my financial situation. In fact, she is the only person in this family who continued to visit and call me regularly even after I stopped giving financial gifts to family members 3 years ago. That revelation hit me like a physical blow. Rose had been testing everyone, and I hadn't even known it. She'd stopped her usual pattern of birthday checks and Christmas money to see who would still maintain contact with her. Apparently, I was the only one who had passed that test. If anyone is watching this video, it means they have chosen to dishonor my memory rather than examine their own behavior. That choice tells you everything you need to know about their character and nothing about my mental state. When the recording ended, Harrison and I sat in silence for several minutes. The emotional weight of watching Rose defend me so thoroughly, even in death, was almost overwhelming. But it was also empowering. She had seen everything, understood everything, and validated everything I'd experienced. Your grandmother was remarkable, Harrison said quietly. I've never had a client who was more thorough in documenting their reasoning, or more determined to protect their chosen beneficiary. 20 minutes later, Michael and Sarah arrived with their attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who introduced himself as David Peterson from Peterson, Willis & Associates in Columbus. They'd clearly spent money they didn't have on legal representation, which told me how desperate they'd become. The introductions were tense and formal. Michael wouldn't meet my eyes, while Sarah alternated between looking defiant and looking ashamed. Peterson immediately tried to take control of the meeting, spreading papers across the table and launching into prepared remarks about undue influence and irregular estate planning. Peterson, Harrison interrupted calmly, before you proceed with your presentation, I think it would be beneficial for everyone to watch some testimony that Mrs. Martinez recorded specifically for situations like this. What kind of testimony? Peterson asked, clearly caught off guard. Video testimony addressing her mental competency and explaining her reasoning for the estate structure. I think you'll find it illuminating. For the next hour, we all watched Rose systematically destroy every argument Peterson had prepared. His confidence visibly deflated as Rose demonstrated not just mental clarity, but a level of detailed knowledge about family dynamics that would be impossible to fake or manipulate. When it was over, the room was dead silent. Peterson was frantically taking notes, probably trying to figure out if he had any case left. Michael was staring at the table, his face red with what looked like shame. Sarah was crying, but these weren't the manipulative tears I'd seen from her before. These were the tears of someone who'd just been forced to see herself clearly for the first time. As you can see, Harrison said to Peterson. Mrs. Martinez was exceptionally lucid about her reasons for structuring the estate as she did. She anticipated challenges to her mental competency and took steps to document her reasoning extensively. Peterson cleared his throat. While the video is certainly compelling, it doesn't address the fundamental issue of undue influence. The dramatic disparity in bequests suggests that someone was manipulating Mrs. Martinez's perceptions of family members. You're absolutely right, I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Someone was manipulating her perceptions. All of you were. Every time you treated me poorly in front of her, every time you dismissed my contributions, every time you made jokes about my supposed greed, you were showing her exactly who you really were. Michael finally looked up. Emma, we didn't know she was keeping track of everything. And that makes it worse, not better, I replied. You treated me badly when you thought no one important was watching. That's not a defense of your character, it's an indictment of it. Sarah wiped her eyes. We never meant to hurt you. Intent doesn't matter when the impact is clear. Rose didn't care about your intentions, she cared about your actions, and your actions consistently and over many years showed her that you didn't value me as a person. Peterson tried to regain control of the conversation. Regardless of past family dynamics, the law requires that estates be distributed in a manner that reflects reasonable family expectations. Mr. Peterson, Harrison interjected, Mrs. Martinez was under no legal obligation to distribute her estate according to anyone's expectations except her own. She was fully competent, acting without coercion, and exercising her absolute right to dispose of her property as she saw fit. Furthermore, I added, Rose didn't cut anyone out completely. She provided a clear path for family members to receive substantial inheritances if they were willing to meet reasonable conditions. The fact that your clients chose litigation over personal growth is their choice, not Rose's failing. That wasn't entirely true anymore, but they didn't know that yet. Rose's estate plan had included provisions for Michael and Sarah, but there was also a clause that voided those provisions if they challenged the will or attempted to damage Rose's reputation. By filing this lawsuit, they had automatically forfeited any claim to inheritance, regardless of whether they later tried to meet the conditions. Peterson spent another 30 minutes trying different legal arguments, but it was clear that Rose had anticipated every possible challenge. She'd undergone psychological evaluation, had multiple witnesses to her mental acuity, and had documented her reasoning so thoroughly that attacking her competency would be nearly impossible. I think we need to take a break. Peterson finally said, I'd like to consult with my clients privately. After they left the room, Harrison looked at me with something that might have been admiration. You handled that very well. You stayed calm, stuck to facts, and didn't let them provoke you into an emotional response. I had a good teacher, I said, thinking of Rose. She always told me that the truth speaks for itself if you let it. There's something else we need to discuss. Harrison continued. The forfeiture clause. By filing this lawsuit, they've automatically voided their right to inherit under any conditions. Even if they dropped the case tomorrow and tried to meet Rose's requirements, they would no longer be eligible. I nodded. I'd suspected as much from reading the legal documents. Rose had been thorough about protecting her wishes from exactly this kind of challenge. What happens to their portion of the estate? It goes directly to the charitable foundation as specified in the will. The total amount would be approximately $15 million that was earmarked for conditional bequests to family members. $15 million that Michael and Sarah had just gambled away on a lawsuit they had no chance of winning. The irony was staggering. In their desperation to claim what they thought they deserved, they had forfeited everything they actually could have received. When they returned to the conference room, Peterson's demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the aggressive confidence he'd displayed earlier. Now he looked like a man who'd realized he'd taken on an unwinnable case. We'd like to propose a settlement, he began carefully. What kind of settlement? Harrison asked. My clients are willing to withdraw their challenge to the will in exchange for a modest inheritance that reflects their status as family members. I almost laughed. They wanted to negotiate after they'd already forfeited everything. Mr. Peterson, I don't think you understand the situation. By filing this lawsuit, your clients have already voided their inheritance rights under the terms of the will. Peterson's face went pale. What do you mean? Harrison opened one of his folders and read directly from Rose's will. In the event that any potential beneficiary challenges this will, attempts to damage the testator's reputation, or initiates legal proceedings questioning the testator's mental competency, All bequests to said beneficiary are immediately and permanently voided, with those assets reverting to the charitable foundation. The silence that followed was profound. Michael's face had gone from red to white, and Sarah looked like she might be sick. Peterson was frantically flipping through papers, probably looking for the clause he'd somehow missed. "You can't be serious," Michael said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm completely serious. Rose knew exactly what kind of people you were, and she planned for exactly this scenario. She gave you a choice: change and be rewarded, or stay the same and lose everything. You chose to stay the same." Sarah started crying again, but this time the tears came with genuine anguish. "We didn't know. Peterson said we had a good case, that we could get the will overturned." "Mr. Peterson should have read the will more carefully before taking your money," I replied, not unkindly but without sympathy. Peterson was clearly scrambling to salvage something from the wreckage of his case. Surely there's some room for negotiation here. The forfeiture clause could be seen as punitive and against public policy. "Mr. Peterson," Harrison said with professional patience, "the forfeiture clause is entirely legal and specifically designed to prevent exactly what your clients are attempting. Mrs. Martinez had every right to condition her bequests on respectful treatment of her wishes. Besides," I added, "there was never any question of your clients not knowing about the consequences. The clause was explained to them at the original estate reading, and they chose to proceed anyway." That wasn't exactly true. Harrison had explained the general conditions but not the specific forfeiture clause. But I didn't feel obligated to help them understand the full scope of their mistake. Michael finally spoke, his voice hollow. "Emma, please. We made a mistake. We can drop the lawsuit, we can do whatever Rose wanted us to do. Don't let us lose everything over one bad decision." "Michael, you didn't make one bad decision. You made 15 years of bad decisions, and this lawsuit was just the culmination of that pattern. Rose gave you multiple opportunities to change, and you responded by attacking her memory and trying to steal money she didn't want you to have." "We're family," Sarah pleaded. "No, we're related. Family doesn't try to destroy each other in court when they don't get what they want." Peterson tried one more angle. "Miss Rodriguez, surely you can see that enforcing this clause would be unnecessarily harsh. Your cousins made a mistake, but they don't deserve to be completely disinherited. Mr. Peterson, let me ask you something. If you had a client who consistently treated their family members poorly, who took advantage of generosity, who made fun of someone's struggles, and who refused to acknowledge their behavior even when confronted with evidence, would you advise that person that they deserved an inheritance?" Peterson didn't answer, which was answer enough. Rose spent years hoping that Michael and Sarah would change on their own. When they didn't, she created incentives for change. When they rejected those incentives and chose legal warfare instead, she had already planned for that outcome too. I stood up, feeling the weight of Rose's protection and wisdom supporting me. "The estate will be distributed exactly as Rose intended, without modification or negotiation." "This isn't over," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," I replied calmly. "You can continue to fight this in court if you want, but you'll only be wasting more money you don't have on a case you can't win. Or you can accept the consequences of your choices and try to build better relationships going forward." As they gathered their papers and prepared to leave, Sarah turned back one more time. "Emma, what if we drop the lawsuit and try to meet Rose's original conditions? What if we really change?" I looked at her for a long moment, seeing something in her eyes that might have been genuine remorse. "Sarah, you can't unring a bell. You've already shown that when faced with accountability, you choose attack over self-reflection. Even if you could legally reverse the forfeiture, why would I trust that any change would be genuine rather than strategic?" She didn't have an answer for that, because there wasn't one. After they left, Harrison and I spent another hour going over the legal implications of what had just happened. The lawsuit would likely be dropped within a few days, once Peterson fully understood how badly he'd miscalculated. The estate would proceed to distribution exactly as Rose had planned, with the charitable foundation receiving an additional $15 million that had been earmarked for family members who proved unworthy of it. "You know," Harrison said, as we finished up, "in 15 years of practice, I've never seen someone handle a family challenge this gracefully. You stayed focused on your grandmother's wishes rather than your own emotions. Rose taught me that the best revenge is living well and staying true to your values," I replied. She also taught me that sometimes people show you exactly who they are, and the kindest thing you can do is believe them. That evening, I drove back to Rose's house on Maple Street. Bob was waiting for me on the front porch, looking older and sadder than I'd ever seen him. "I heard about the meeting," he said, as I walked up the steps. "I figured you would. Pat and I want you to know that we think Michael and Sarah are idiots for filing that lawsuit. We also want you to know that we're not asking for anything from you or Rose's estate." I sat down in the porch swing beside him, the same swing where Rose and I had spent countless summer evenings talking about everything and nothing. "What do you want, Bob? I want to understand how we let it get this bad. I want to know how I can have a relationship with you that isn't based on guilt or obligation or money." He paused, staring out at the street where we'd all grown up together. "I want to be the kind of uncle you deserve to have all along." "That's going to take time and effort," I said honestly. I know I don't have any right to ask for that chance after all these years of staying quiet when I should have spoken up. But Emma, you're the only family I have left that I actually respect, and I don't want to lose that. For the first time since this whole thing began, I felt a glimmer of hope for genuine reconciliation with at least one family member. Bob wasn't asking for money or making excuses. He was asking for the opportunity to do better, and that was something I could work with. "We can try," I said. "But it has to be real change, not just good intentions." "I understand. And Emma, Rose would be proud of how you handled yourself today. You honored her wishes and protected her memory, while still giving them every chance to do the right thing." As we sat in the growing darkness, I realized that Rose had accomplished something remarkable through her estate planning. She hadn't just transferred wealth, she'd forced every family member to confront the truth about themselves and their relationships. Some, like Michael and Sarah, had chosen to reject that truth and face the consequences. Others, like Bob, were beginning the hard work of accepting it and changing. And me, I was finally free to build the kind of family relationships I actually wanted, based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and guilt. Rose had given me something more valuable than money. She'd given me the power to demand better treatment, and the financial security to walk away if I didn't get it. The $10 bill was still in my wallet, but it no longer represented shame or injustice. Now it represented the beginning of a journey that had led me to this moment, sitting on my grandmother's porch, finally understanding my own worth. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of building Rose's foundation and managing her investments. Tomorrow, I would start creating something positive from the ashes of our family's dysfunction. But tonight, I just sat in the darkness and felt grateful for a grandmother who had loved me enough to plan my freedom, even if she couldn't be here to see me claim it. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of what had once been Rose's biggest commercial property investment, now transformed into the headquarters of the Rose Martinez Foundation for Foster Care Transition. The irony wasn't lost on me that the building she'd secretly purchased 15 years ago with profits from her first major stock investment was now housing the legacy she'd always intended to create. The morning sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over downtown Springfield, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table where I was meeting with the foundation's newly hired staff. Dr. Maria Santos, our program director, was presenting the first quarterly report on our pilot program for aging out foster teens. The numbers were better than we'd hoped: 18 young adults placed in transitional housing, 12 enrolled in job training programs, and 6 already in stable employment. The mentorship component has been particularly successful. Dr. Santos explained, clicking to the next slide in her presentation. Pairing participants with adults who've experienced similar challenges creates trust in ways that traditional social services often can't achieve. I nodded, thinking about how Rose would have appreciated that detail. She'd always believed that understanding came from shared experience, not theoretical knowledge. The foundation's approach reflected her practical wisdom: hire people who'd lived through the foster system to help others navigate it, fund programs that addressed real needs, rather than bureaucratic requirements, and measure success through life outcomes rather than paperwork compliance. My phone buzzed with a text from Bob. "Pat's physical therapy appointment went well. Doctor says she might be ready to drive again next month. She's been asking when you might have time for lunch." The relationship with Bob and Pat had evolved slowly over the past months. There had been no dramatic reconciliation scene, no tearful apologies that fixed everything overnight. Instead, there had been small, consistent changes. Bob calling to check on me without asking for anything. Pat sending thoughtful cards on holidays that actually acknowledged my interests, rather than generic sentiments. Conversations that focused on understanding rather than defending past behavior. The breakthrough had come 3 months ago when Pat had asked me to help her write a letter to Michael and Sarah. Not asking me to fix their relationship or mediate their problems, but genuinely seeking guidance on how to communicate with adult children who were facing consequences for their choices. "I don't know how to love them without enabling them," she'd said during one of our phone calls. "I don't know how to support them without making their problems my responsibility." It was the first time anyone in my family had asked me for emotional wisdom rather than financial assistance. Pat was learning the same lesson I'd spent years mastering, that helping someone sometimes means letting them struggle with the natural consequences of their decisions. Michael and Sarah had dropped their lawsuit exactly as Harrison had predicted, but not before spending nearly $20,000 on legal fees they couldn't afford. Peterson had apparently neglected to mention the forfeiture clause until after he'd collected a substantial retainer, leaving them not only without inheritance, but also deeper in debt than when they'd started. The aftermath had been predictably messy. Michael had been forced to declare bankruptcy and move in with friends, while Sarah took a second job to try to keep their house. But instead of using their financial crisis as motivation for the kind of personal growth Rose had hoped to inspire, they doubled down on resentment and blame. Sarah had sent me a series of increasingly desperate emails over the past few months, alternating between attempts at emotional manipulation and outright hostility. The latest had arrived just last week. "I hope you're happy with yourself. We're losing everything while you're playing philanthropist with money that should have been ours. Grandma Rose would be ashamed of what you've become." I'd shown the email to Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the therapist I'd started seeing, to help process the complex emotions around my family situation and sudden wealth. Her response had been characteristically direct. "Emma, what do you think Rose would actually be ashamed of in this situation? I think she'd be ashamed that it took her death to force these conversations. I think she'd be ashamed that she waited so long to hold people accountable for their behavior. And what do you think she'd be proud of?" That question was easier to answer. Rose would be proud that I'd used her gift to create something meaningful rather than just accumulating wealth for its own sake. She'd be proud that I'd maintained my integrity throughout the legal challenges. She'd be proud that I'd given family members genuine opportunities for reconciliation, while refusing to accept abuse disguised as family obligation. Most of all, she'd be proud that I'd finally learned to value myself the way she'd always valued me. The foundation work had become more fulfilling than I'd expected. Working with young adults who'd aged out of foster care meant working with people who understood what it felt like to be unwanted, to have your worth questioned, to be blamed for circumstances beyond your control. These were my people in ways that my biological family had never been. There was Marcus, 19 years old and brilliant, who'd been moved between 12 different foster homes before aging out at 18, with nothing but a garbage bag of belongings and a high school diploma. He'd been living in his car when our outreach coordinator found him, working 2 part-time jobs and trying to save enough money for community college tuition. The foundation had provided him with transitional housing, career counseling, and a scholarship program that covered not just tuition, but also the laptop, textbooks, and professional clothes that no one thinks to mention when they talk about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. 6 months later, Marcus was on the dean's list and working as a paid intern at a local engineering firm. There was Destiny, 21 and pregnant, who'd been kicked out of her foster home the day she turned 18, because her foster parents' payments ended. She'd been sleeping on friends' couches and working at a fast food restaurant when our housing program offered her a 1-bedroom apartment and connections to prenatal care. "Nobody ever asked me what I wanted before," she told me during one of our monthly check-ins. "In foster care, they just moved you around and told you to be grateful. But you actually listen when I say what I need." That comment had stayed with me because it perfectly captured what had been missing from my own family relationships. Being seen, being heard, being treated like your thoughts and feelings mattered. These young adults were teaching me as much as I was helping them. The knock on my office door interrupted my reflection. "Come in." I called expecting Dr. Santos, with follow-up questions about the quarterly report. Instead it was James Harrison, carrying a folder that looked suspiciously like legal documents. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by without an appointment," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "But I wanted to deliver this personally rather than sending it through the mail." "What is it?"
The final settlement from Michael and Sarah's lawsuit. They've officially withdrawn all claims and signed documents acknowledging that the estate was distributed according to your grandmother's valid wishes. He paused, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. They've also agreed to a non-disclosure agreement that prevents them from making any public statements questioning Rose's mental competency or your inheritance. I opened the folder and scanned the legal language, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the legal challenges were finally over, sadness that it had come to this kind of formal conclusion to family relationships. There's something else, Harrison continued. Peterson's firm is being investigated by the Ohio State Bar for taking on a case without properly reviewing the relevant documents. Apparently, several of his other clients have come forward with similar complaints about inadequate representation. The poetic justice of that development wasn't lost on me. Peterson had gambled with Michael and Sarah's financial future, just as recklessly as they'd gambled with their family relationships. All of them had chosen short-term thinking over long-term consequences, and all of them were now facing the results of those choices. What happens now? I asked. Now nothing happens. The estate is settled, the foundation is operational, and you're free to move forward however you choose. Harrison closed his briefcase and stood up. Emma, I want you to know that working on this case has been one of the most interesting experiences of my career. Your grandmother was remarkable, but watching you honor her vision, while staying true to your own values, has been equally impressive. After he left, I sat in my office looking out at the city where I'd grown up feeling like I didn't quite belong. Springfield looked different now, not because the place had changed, but because my relationship to it had evolved. I wasn't the unwanted child anymore, or the family disappointment, or the convenient solution to other people's problems. I was Emma Rodriguez, director of a foundation that was changing lives, granddaughter of a woman who'd built an empire while everyone thought she was just getting by. My phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was local. Emma, this is Sandra Chen, Sarah's sister-in-law. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I wanted to reach out to you personally. I tensed, wondering if this was another attempt to get money or sympathy for Michael and Sarah's situation. I wanted to thank you, Sandra continued, surprising me completely. Thank me for what? For not giving in to their manipulation, for holding them accountable even when it was hard. She paused, and I could hear children playing in the background. Sarah and Michael have been toxic influences in our family for years, but everyone was afraid to call them out because family is family, you know. Watching you refuse to enable their behavior has given the rest of us permission to set boundaries too. That perspective hadn't occurred to me. I'd been so focused on the immediate family dynamics that I hadn't considered how their behavior might have affected other people in their lives. Sarah called me last week, asking if I could lend them money for rent. Sandra continued. 6 months ago, I would have felt guilty and said yes, even though they've never paid back previous loans. But this time I said no. I told her that adults are responsible for solving their own problems. How did she react to that? About as well as you'd expect. She accused me of being selfish and uncaring. But you know what? I realized that being called selfish for having boundaries is better than being used by people who call it love. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of standing up to family dysfunction. By refusing to accept poor treatment, I hadn't just changed my own life, I'd given other people permission to expect better for themselves too. That evening, I drove to Rose's house on Maple Street. Bob had been maintaining the property while I decided what to do with it, and we'd established a routine of having dinner there once a week. It felt important to keep that connection to Rose's memory, while building a healthier relationship with the family members who were willing to do the work. Bob was in the kitchen when I arrived, making his famous spaghetti sauce that actually was worth the reputation he'd given it over the years. Smells amazing, I said, hanging my jacket on the back of Rose's favorite chair. Pat's coming over too, if that's okay with you. She wanted to show you something she's been working on. Of course it's okay. Pat arrived 20 minutes later, moving more easily than she had since the stroke, but still using a cane for stability. She was carrying a photo album I'd never seen before. I've been going through old pictures, she explained as we settled in the
living room after dinner. I found things I'd forgotten about, things that made me realize how differently I remember some events compared to how they actually happened. She opened the album to a page of photos from my high school graduation. There I was in cap and gown, beaming with pride, surrounded by family members who looked bored. Bob was checking his watch. Pat was looking at something off camera. Michael was making faces at Sarah behind my back. I remembered this as a happy family celebration, Pat said quietly. But looking at these pictures, I can see that we weren't really celebrating you at all. We were just going through the motions. She turned the page to show photos from Michael's community college graduation 2 years later. The contrast was stark. Everyone was engaged, smiling genuinely, focused on celebrating his achievement. The difference in energy and attention was obvious even in still photographs. I've been doing this with pictures from the past 15 years, Pat continued. Looking for patterns in how we treated you versus how we treated Michael and Sarah. The evidence is pretty damning. We spent the next hour going through the album together, with Pat pointing out moments where she could now see the differential treatment that had been invisible to her at the time. Birthday parties where my cake was store-bought while Michael's was homemade. Holiday gatherings where my gifts were practical while theirs were thoughtful. Graduation celebrations where my achievements were minimized while theirs were amplified. Why are you showing me this? I asked when we'd finished looking through the album. Because I need you to know that I see it now. Really see it, not just intellectually understand it. Pat's voice was steady but emotional. And because I want to document the truth so that when my memory gets fuzzy with age, I'll have proof of what really happened and why you made the choices you made. It was the most meaningful apology I'd ever received from anyone in my family. Not just words expressing regret, but evidence that she'd done the hard work of examining her own behavior and accepting responsibility for its impact. There's something else, Bob said, pulling out a manila envelope. We've been working on this together. Inside the envelope were legal documents establishing a small scholarship fund in Rose's name, funded by Bob and Pat's retirement savings. It wasn't a large amount compared to the foundation's resources, but it represented something more valuable than money: genuine understanding of Rose's values and a commitment to honoring them. We can't undo the past, Pat said. We can't give you back the childhood you deserved or the family support you should have had. But we can try to be the kind of people Rose would be proud of going forward. As I drove back to Chicago that night, I reflected on how much had changed since that October morning when Bob had called about Pat's stroke. The family that had once made me feel small and unwanted had been transformed by crisis and accountability into something I'd never thought possible: a group of people who actually knew and valued me for who I was. The foundation work continued to grow and evolve. Within a year, we'd expanded to serve 3 counties and had developed partnerships with employers who specifically recruited from our job training programs. Marcus had started his own nonprofit focused on foster youth and STEM fields. Destiny had finished her nursing program and was working at the local hospital while raising her daughter in stable housing. But perhaps the most meaningful development was the unexpected friendship I'd built with Dr. Santos. Maria had aged out of foster care herself 20 years earlier and had spent her career working to improve outcomes for kids in similar situations. She understood the particular pain of family rejection in ways that my therapist, however well-meaning, never could. You know what the hardest part is? Maria had said during one of our late-night planning sessions. It's not the poverty or the instability or even the abuse. It's the feeling that you're disposable, that your worth is conditional on your usefulness to other people. Yes, I'd replied, feeling understood in a way that was both painful and healing. And then when you succeed despite all of that, people act like your success invalidates their treatment of you. Like if you turned out okay, then what they did wasn't really that bad. That's why this work matters so much. Maria had said, we're not just providing services, we're proving to these kids that they have unconditional worth, that they deserve support not because they've earned it, but because they're human beings with potential. 2 years after Rose's death, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Sarah, postmarked from a women's shelter in Columbus where she was apparently living after her divorce from Michael. The handwriting was shaky, and there were tear stains on the paper. Emma, it began. I know I have no right to contact you after everything that's happened. I know you probably think I'm writing because I want money or help, and maybe part of me is hoping for that. But mostly I just wanted to tell you that I finally understand what Rose was trying to teach us. The letter went on to describe Sarah's journey through the consequences of her choices. The house had been foreclosed. Michael had blamed her for their financial problems and become emotionally abusive. She'd ended up in a domestic violence shelter with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. For the first time in my life, I know what it feels like to have nowhere to turn, no family to bail you out, no safety net to catch you when you fall, she wrote. I know what it feels like to be truly alone, and I finally understand what we put you through all those years. The letter included no requests for money or assistance, no manipulation disguised as apology. It was simply an acknowledgement of truth and an expression of genuine remorse. Sarah had apparently enrolled in a program for domestic violence survivors and was working on rebuilding her life from the ground up. I don't expect forgiveness, the letter concluded. I don't even think I deserve it. But I wanted you to know that Rose was right about everything, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to see it. I showed the letter to Dr. Walsh during our monthly check-in session. How do you feel about receiving this? She asked, sad, mostly. Sad that it took her hitting rock bottom to develop empathy. Sad that she had to lose everything to understand what I'd been trying to tell them for years. I paused, considering my emotions more carefully, but also relieved, I think. Relieved that the damage wasn't irreversible, that she's capable of growth even if it came too late to save our relationship. Do you want to respond to her? I don't know yet, maybe someday. But not now. She needs to do the work of rebuilding herself for her own sake, not because she's hoping to get something from me. Dr. Walsh nodded approvingly. That's very wise. Recovery and personal growth have to come from internal motivation, not external rewards. 3 years after inheriting Rose's estate, I finally felt ready to make a decision about her house on Maple Street. I'd been using it as a retreat space and meeting place with Bob and Pat, but it felt wrong to keep it as a private residence when it could serve a larger purpose. Working with the Foundation's board, we converted Rose's house into a transitional living facility for foster youth who were aging out of the system. The bedrooms became individual apartments for young adults who needed a stepping stone between foster care and independent living. The kitchen became a place where residents could learn practical life skills while sharing meals together. The living room became a study space and community gathering area. The day we opened the Rose Martinez Transitional Living Center, I stood in the same spot where I'd found that crumpled $10 bill years earlier. The coffee table was gone, replaced by comfortable seating and bookshelves filled with resources for young adults starting their independent lives. But I could still picture that moment when everything changed, when a small act of blame became the catalyst for a much larger transformation. Bob and Pat were there for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, along with Marcus and Destiny and dozens of other young adults whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. Dr. Santos gave a speech about the importance of stable housing and successful transitions to adulthood. The mayor presented a key to the city, recognizing the Foundation's impact on the community. But the moment that mattered most to me came when Destiny approached me with her 2-year-old daughter in her arms. "Miss Emma," she said, "I wanted Sophia to meet you. She's going to grow up knowing that there are people in the world who help others just because it's right, not because they want something back." As I held Sophia, I thought about the little girl I'd been, desperate for unconditional love and acceptance. I thought about Rose, quietly building a legacy that would outlast her own life. I thought about the power of choosing love over resentment, growth over stagnation, hope over bitterness. The $10 bill was still in my wallet, but it no longer represented injustice or pain. Now it represented transformation, the proof that small moments of cruelty could be alchemized into large gestures of love. Rose had seen past the immediate hurt to the person I could become, if I had the resources and security to grow into my full potential. That evening, I sat in Rose's old bedroom, now converted into my office at the transitional center. The view from her window looked out over the neighborhood where we'd all grown up, where lessons about worth and family and forgiveness had been learned the hard way by everyone involved. My phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Bob. "Emma, I just wanted to say thank you for what you did today. Opening this place in Rose's honor, creating something beautiful from all the pain our family caused. She would be so proud." "I hope so," I replied. "I hope she knows that her gift didn't just change my life, it changed how I think about what family can be." "What do you mean?" "I mean that family isn't just the people you're related to. It's the people who see your worth, who support your growth, who love you not because of what you can do for them, but because of who you are." I looked out the window at the young adults moving into their new apartments, starting fresh chapters of their lives with support and dignity. Rose gave me the resources to build the kind of family I always wanted, one based on choice and mutual respect rather than obligation and resentment. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was the real inheritance Rose had left me. Not just the money, though that had made everything else possible. Not just the vindication, though that had been healing. But the understanding that love is a choice we make every day, that family is something we create rather than something we're trapped by, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the security to become who they're meant to be. The $10 bill would stay in my wallet forever, a reminder of how far I'd traveled from that 12-year-old girl who'd been blamed for taking what was rightfully hers. But now it represented something else entirely, the beginning of a story that proved greed and generosity are often found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes the people who call you selfish are really just afraid of your strength. Rose had built me an empire, but more importantly, she'd built me a foundation of self-worth that no one could ever take away. And now I was using both to build something that would outlast us all, a legacy of love that chose to heal rather than harm, to include rather than exclude, to lift up rather than tear down. The girl they'd called greedy for taking $10 had become a woman who gave millions away, not because she had to, but because she finally understood the difference between taking what you deserve and sharing what you've been blessed to receive. And in the end, that understanding was worth more than all the money in the world. 5 years after Rose's death, I received an invitation that I never thought would arrive. It was addressed in careful handwriting to Miss Emma Rodriguez, Director Rose Martinez Foundation, and came with a return address I didn't recognize in Cleveland, Ohio. When I opened the envelope, I found a wedding invitation along with a handwritten note that made my hands shake. Dear Emma, the note began, I know this might seem strange coming from me, but I wanted to invite you to my wedding. I also wanted to tell you something that I've never told anyone before, something about that $10 incident that changed everything for our family. The note was signed by Michael, and the wedding invitation was for his marriage to a woman named Jennifer Walsh. Not Dr. Jennifer Walsh, my therapist, but apparently someone with the same name who worked as a social worker in Cleveland. The coincidence of names made me smile, thinking about how life sometimes creates patterns that feel almost too meaningful to be random. I've been in therapy for 2 years, Michael's note continued, working on understanding why I became the kind of person who could treat family the way I treated you. Jennifer helped me realize that I need to make amends, not because I want something from you, but because carrying this guilt is preventing me from becoming the man I want to be. The revelation in his note was devastating in its simplicity. Michael admitted that he had known the $10 was mine that day when we were children. He had seen me earn it, had watched Rose hand it to me with pride, and had understood completely that it was payment for work I had done. But when he saw an opportunity to get me in trouble, he had taken it without thinking about the consequences. I was jealous, he wrote, not of the money, but of how proud Rose looked when she gave it to you. I wanted that look directed at me, and when I couldn't earn it, I decided to destroy your moment instead. I never thought it would become the defining story of who you were in our family's eyes. The letter went on to describe how that moment of childhood cruelty had escalated into a pattern of behavior that he'd never questioned until he lost everything. How calling me greedy had become a way to justify his own selfishness. How making me the problem child had allowed him to avoid examining his own shortcomings. How my success had threatened his self-image because it proved that hard work and character mattered more than the excuses he'd been making for himself. Jennifer says that hurt people, he wrote, and I was hurting in ways I didn't even understand. But that doesn't excuse what I did to you, and it doesn't make it your responsibility to forgive me. I just wanted you to know the truth, finally, after all these years. I sat in my office at the foundation, holding this letter that rewrote the origin story of my family's dysfunction, and felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Not because Michael was finally telling the truth, though that mattered, but because his confession confirmed something I'd always suspected, but had never been able to prove. The $10 incident hadn't been a misunderstanding or a moment of childhood confusion. It had been a deliberate act of sabotage by someone who saw my happiness as a threat to his own position in the family hierarchy. That evening, I called Dr. Walsh to discuss the letter. We'd reduced our sessions to monthly check-ins over the past year, as I'd worked through most of the major emotional issues around my family situation, but this felt like something worth processing with professional help. How do you feel about receiving this confession? She asked after I'd read Michael's letter aloud. Vindicated mostly. It confirms what I always knew deep down, but could never prove. That I wasn't crazy or oversensitive, or imagining the hostility. I paused, considering my emotions more carefully, but also sad. Sad that it took him losing everything to develop enough self-awareness to tell the truth. Do you think his confession changes anything for you? It changes my understanding of what happened, but it doesn't change the impact of living with the consequences for 15 years. It doesn't undo the damage or erase the pain. I looked out the window at the transitional living center, where young adults were coming home from work and school, building the independent lives they'd been denied in foster care. But maybe it helps explain why Rose was so determined to document everything. Maybe she suspected that the truth would eventually come out, and she wanted to make sure I had the resources to handle it when it did. Dr. Walsh was quiet for a moment, then asked the question I'd been avoiding. Are you going to respond to his invitation? I don't know yet. Part of me wants to see if his change is genuine, or just another performance designed to get something from me. Part of me thinks it doesn't matter either way, because I don't need his validation anymore. What would Rose want you to do? That question stopped me cold. Rose had always been a believer in second chances, but only for people who had done the genuine work of understanding their mistakes and changing their behavior. She'd structured her entire estate plan around the principle that forgiveness should be earned through demonstrated change, rather than given freely to people who demanded it as a right. Rose would want me to follow my instincts, I said finally. She'd want me to protect my own peace, while staying open to the possibility of genuine reconciliation, if Michael had truly changed. 2 weeks later, I made a decision that surprised even me. I drove to Cleveland for Michael's wedding, not because I'd forgiven him, or because I wanted to rebuild our relationship, but because I was curious about who he'd become, and whether his transformation was authentic. The wedding was small and intimate, held in a community center that served as both ceremony venue and reception hall. Jennifer turned out to be warm and genuine, someone whose eyes lit up when she talked about her work helping families navigate the child welfare system. She greeted me with a hug that felt real rather than obligatory, and thanked me for coming without any awkwardness or underlying agenda. Michael talks about you often, she told me during the cocktail hour. About how much he regrets the way your family treated you, and about how proud he is of what you've built with the foundation. He's proud of me. The concept was so foreign that I had trouble processing it. He says you're the strongest person he knows, that you took the worst thing that happened to your family and turned it into something that helps other people heal. Jennifer's voice was sincere, without any hint of manipulation or performance. He says Rose knew exactly what she was doing when she chose you to carry on her legacy. During the ceremony, I watched Michael make vows about honesty, accountability, and choosing love over fear. The man standing at the altar bore little resemblance to the cousin who had made my childhood miserable and my adulthood complicated. This version of Michael spoke about taking responsibility for past mistakes, about the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of their usefulness to him, about building relationships based on mutual respect rather than transactional convenience. At the reception, he approached me during a quiet moment between toasts. Emma, thank you for coming. I know it couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, I agreed, but I needed to see for myself if your change was real. And what's your verdict? I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative charm that had always been his default mode when he wanted something. Instead, I saw something I'd never seen from him before: genuine humility. I think you've done the work, I said finally. I think you've actually examined your behavior and taken responsibility for its impact. That's more than I ever expected from you. Michael's eyes filled with tears. I know I can't undo the damage I caused. I know saying sorry doesn't fix 15 years of making you feel worthless. But Emma, I need you to know that losing Rose's inheritance was the best thing that ever happened to me. How can you say that? Because it forced me to confront who I really was, instead of who I pretended to be. Because it made me face the consequences of treating people badly. Because it led me to therapy, which led me to Jennifer, which led me to finally understanding what real love looks like. He paused, wiping his eyes. Rose gave me exactly what I needed, even if it wasn't what I wanted. During the reception, I found myself in conversation with other wedding guests, who shared stories about Michael's volunteer work with homeless youth, his commitment to his recovery program, his dedication to being honest even when it was uncomfortable. These weren't performances for my benefit. These were people who knew him well, and had witnessed his transformation over several years. Jennifer's maid of honor, a woman named Carol, who worked at the same social services agency, pulled me aside during the dancing. I hope this doesn't sound presumptuous, she said, but I wanted to thank you for not giving in when Michael tried to manipulate you through that lawsuit. Jennifer says it was the wake-up call he needed to finally get serious about changing. I didn't do it to help him, I replied honestly. I did it to protect myself and honor Rose's wishes. I know, but sometimes the most loving thing we can do for someone is refuse to enable their destructive behavior. Michael needed to hit rock bottom before he could start building something real. As the evening wound down, Michael approached me one more time. Emma, I know I have no right to ask this, but I was wondering if you might consider staying in touch. Not because I want anything from you, but because I'd like the chance to know the person you've become when you're not defending yourself against my attacks. It was an interesting way to phrase the request, acknowledging that our entire previous relationship had been built on a foundation of his hostility and my defensive responses. The question was whether we could build something different now that he'd removed the hostility from the equation. "We can try," I said carefully. "But it has to be genuine, Michael. It has to be about building a real relationship, not about managing your guilt or trying to get back into my good graces." "I understand. And Emma, I want you to know that Rose would be incredibly proud of who you've become. Not just because of the foundation or the money you've given away, but because you chose to heal, instead of seeking revenge. Because you turned your pain into purpose." Driving back to Chicago the next morning, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. The scared, angry child who had been blamed for taking $10 had become a woman who gave away millions. The family scapegoat had become the person everyone looked to for wisdom and support. The supposed problem child had become the solution to problems she'd never created. But more than that, I'd learned that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars or properties or investment portfolios. True wealth was the freedom to choose love over bitterness, growth over stagnation, healing over harm. Rose had given me financial security, but she'd also given me something more valuable. The example of how to use power responsibly, and how to love people without losing yourself in the process. 6 months after Michael's wedding, I received a package in the mail from Sarah. Inside was a small ceramic bowl, obviously handmade, along with a note written on simple stationery. "Emma," the note read, "I made this in art therapy at the Women's Center. It's not much, but I wanted to send you something I created with my own hands, instead of something I bought with money I didn't earn. I've been clean and sober for 8 months now, and I'm learning to value things that can't be purchased or stolen, or manipulated away from me." The note went on to describe Sarah's journey through recovery, and her work helping other women who had survived domestic violence. She didn't ask for money, or forgiveness, or reconciliation. She simply wanted to share her progress, and express gratitude for the example I'd set by refusing to enable destructive behavior. "I understand now why Rose chose you," Sarah wrote, "not because you were perfect, but because you had integrity. Because you chose to be strong, instead of choosing to be victims. Because you built something beautiful from the worst thing that happened to our family." That package sits on my desk at the foundation office, a reminder that healing is possible, even in the most damaged relationships, but that it has to be genuine and self-motivated, rather than strategic and manipulative. Looking back on everything that had happened since that October morning, when Bob called about Pat's stroke, I realized that Rose had orchestrated more than an inheritance transfer. She'd created a catalyst for transformation that had rippled through multiple generations and dozens of lives. The young adults who'd found stability through the foundation, the families who'd learned to set healthy boundaries, the community members who'd discovered the difference between charity and empowerment. All of them had been touched by Rose's decision to choose love over convenience, accountability over acceptance, truth over peace. The $10 bill was still in my wallet, but it no longer represented injustice, or pain, or the arbitrary cruelty of people who were supposed to love me. Now it represented the beginning of a story about resilience, about the power of one person's vision to change everything, about the difference between being related to people and being family with them. Rose had seen something in that 12-year-old girl that even I hadn't recognized, the potential to transform suffering into service, isolation into connection, judgment into justice. She'd invested not just in my financial future, but in my emotional development, my character formation, my capacity to love, without losing myself in the process. And in the end, that investment had paid dividends that could never be calculated in monetary terms. It had created a legacy that would outlast all of us, a foundation built on the revolutionary idea that love is something we choose to give, rather than something we demand to receive. The girl they'd called greedy for taking $10 had learned the most important lesson of all, that true generosity comes not from having much to give, but from understanding that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and the chance to become who they're meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.